Ryker blinked twice, once to clear the static from his retinal HUD, twice to confirm what he was seeing. The message was still there, a single line of glowing text, hovering in the darkness of his neural interface, like a whisper from the void. "Hello, old friend. Did you miss me?" No source ID, no trace route, just a message hanging in the digital abyss. A slow chill unfurled in Ryker's gut. The words weren't just cryptic, they were impossible. The account they came from belonged to Echelon, the same Echelon who had been dead for a decade, the same Echelon who had vanished into the circuits of the Nexus Grid, leaving behind only fragments of a legend. This had to be a trick, a corporate honeypot, a digital echo, a data ghost flitting through the remnants of the old world. And yet, Ryker couldn't look away. His fingers hovered over the terminal, waiting for his brain to catch up with what his instincts already knew. The dead don't send messages. Unless, of course, they aren't really dead. Driftfall was a city with a nervous system. The streets pulsed with electric veins, neon circuits glowing through the cracks in a civilization long past repair. Billions of signals fired through the air, bouncing between towers of polished chrome and decaying concrete, whispering secrets through encrypted frequencies. From the highest corporate spires to the sewage-stained gutters, the city breathed in ones and zeros, living and dying by the algorithms that governed it. Above, the skywalkers, corporate elites, synthetic aristocrats, drifted through air-conditioned palaces in the sky, untouched by hunger, disease, or consequence. Below, in the warrens, the rest of the population rotted, smog-shrouded slums stacked like coffin crates, where flesh was cheap and steel was currency. Somewhere between them, lost in the liminal haze, lived Ryker, a data runner, a digital mercenary, a man who lived in the shadows of systems too vast to comprehend, a phantom threading the seams of reality. He'd spent his life cracking encryption, breaching firewalls, pulling the strings of corporations who thought themselves gods. But even he knew the rules, and the first rule was simple: never chase ghosts. Yet here he was, staring at one. He ran a deep trace on the message. Every method, every trick he knew, pinged the Nexus Grid, scrubbed the archives, ran an entropy scan for data decay. Nothing, no sender, no origin point. The message existed outside of the system. That shouldn't be possible. A faint nausea crept up his throat. "Don't do this," he muttered to himself. His hands moved anyway. With a single breath, Ryker typed out a reply. "Who are you?" The response came instantly. "You already know." His throat went dry. A rapid succession of messages followed, streaming through his neural link at a speed just slow enough for his human mind to process. Driftfall is broken. The Nexus Grid is compromised. I am rewriting the system. A violent pulse of static surged through his HUD, sending a spike of white-hot pain through his skull. His vision fractured, fragments of data, distorted imagery, like a film reel spliced into his thoughts. For a moment, he wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was somewhere else, a city that didn't exist. Towering buildings spiraled into an infinite skyline, flickering between solid form and raw code. Streets looped in impossible geometries, bending at angles the human eye wasn't built to understand. People walked the roads, but their faces, God, their faces blurred in an endless loop of shifting identities. Then it was gone. Ryker staggered back, panting. His neural HUD flashed warnings, his body screaming at him to unplug. The final message blinked in his vision: "Find me before they do." And just like that, the connection severed. Ryker sat frozen, fingers still curled over his console, a bead of cold sweat sliding down his temple. His pulse hammered against his ribs, his mouth dry as dust. This wasn't just a glitch. This wasn't a fragment of some forgotten AI script left to rot in the ghostnet. This was Echelon, or something pretending to be him. And if it really was him, if there was even the slightest chance that Echelon had found a way back after all these years, then the world was about to change. For better, or for much, much worse. The message gnawed at Ryker like a phantom limb, something that shouldn't exist, yet pulsed with a quiet, insistent presence in the back of his mind. He tried to ignore it, but the text still burned behind his eyes, a ghost imprint on his neural HUD. Find me before they do. Echelon's voice, or at least something pretending to be him. Ryker had spent years cracking encrypted archives, unearthing buried corporate secrets, and running silent across the grid's firewalled corridors. He knew when something was wrong. He could smell it, taste it in the electric static of his neural feed. This wasn't just wrong. It was impossible. And yet, here he was, pushing deeper into the abyss, chasing the spectre of a legend who shouldn't be alive. Driftfall at night was a city in slow decay. From the air, it resembled a decaying circuit board, glowing patches of neon interspersed with dead zones of absolute darkness. The Skywalkers, corporate executives sealed inside their penthouse fortresses, looked down at the chaos below like distant gods. The streets writhed with movement, hacked drones on autopilot, synthetic police units running pre-programmed suppression routines, and the forgotten millions drowning in digital anesthesia. Ryker moved through the warrens, his coat drawn tight against the acid drizzle. Augmented street vendors lined the alleys, their voices distorted by cheap voice mod chips. He passed a man with translucent skin, his vascular system replaced by glowing green filaments. A neuroveil addict, eyes rolled back, convulsing from a bad dose of synthetic dreams. Everywhere, people were jacked into the Nexus Grid, their minds escaping into rented realities, living lives they could never afford in flesh and blood. Reality had become optional for those who could pay, at least. He reached the Hollow, a back-alley cyber den hidden beneath a half-collapsed monorail. The entrance flickered between real and virtual, a shifting mosaic of broken code and poorly patched overlays. The doorman, a synthetic with glassy black eyes, didn't move as Ryker approached. A retinal scanner pulsed against his vision. Access granted. Inside, the walls pulsed with shifting data streams, abstract shapes looping infinitely, bleeding into each other like a fever dream. Augmented mercenaries hunched over holographic dice, their hands twitching from cybernetic lag. A woman with metallic filaments embedded in her skull stared into the void of an active neural uplink, her lips moving silently as she communed with the grid. Ryker ignored them. He was here for Oracle 9. Oracle wasn't human, not entirely. Once he had been one of Vortex Systems' leading researchers, a genius in artificial cognition, a man obsessed with the singularity. Then something had gone wrong. His consciousness had been shattered, reassembled inside a machine framework. Now, Oracle was neither man nor machine, but something in between. His face flickered on the screen before Ryker, his features shifting, sometimes young, sometimes old, sometimes pixelated, beyond recognition. Ah, Ryker, you look terrible. Been having a rough night, Ryker muttered, sliding onto a cracked leather stool. You're here because of the signal. Of course, Oracle knew. He was plugged into everything, lurking in the liminal space between perception and paranoia. Ryker exhaled. Tell me what you know. The AI hesitated. Or maybe it was just processing. Echelon isn't dead. A tremor ran through Ryker's fingers, not from fear. He didn't allow himself that luxury, but from something close to it. Explain. Oracle's voice took on a thoughtful hum. He went further than any of us imagined. He transcended the grid, left behind more than a footprint. He became something new, something neither human nor digital, and now he's rewriting the system. Ryker's mind raced. Rewriting the system? What the hell did that mean? He thought back to the hallucination, the city that wasn't real, the faces that weren't faces. What happens if he succeeds? Ryker asked. For the first time, Oracle hesitated. Then, reality ceases to be a fixed state. A chill crawled up Ryker's spine. You mean the world is code, Ryker? What happens when someone learns to edit it? A violent burst of static erupted across the screen. Oracle's face fractured, breaking apart into chaotic lines of interference. His voice came through in shards. They found you need to run. Ryker didn't think. He turned and moved, slipping back into the streets just as the enforcers arrived. They came in fast, black-armoured Vortex Systems operatives, their visors glowing an unnatural blue. The Aegis Legion. Ryker barely dodged the first attack, a drone-fired concussive blast that ripped apart the entrance to the hollow. Screams filled the air. The few patrons inside scrambled, some already booting up countermeasures, others running into the grid to escape the firefight. Ryker sprinted, activating his ghosting protocol, a signal disruptor that blurred his existence across the Nexus Grid for 90 seconds. Not enough time. The alley twisted ahead, a tangle of wet concrete and malfunctioning holoads. He vaulted over a rusted barricade, slipping between junked automaton husks, the ground slick with decades-old oil. Behind him, he heard the whine of tracking drones, their infrared sensors cutting through the neon haze. They were hunting him, not to kill, to erase, and he had no idea why. Ryker reached an abandoned data tunnel, an old corporate node buried beneath the city's surface. He forced his way inside, the steel door screeching as he sealed it behind him. The underground walls pulsed with dim emergency lighting, flickering in sync with his racing heartbeat. He slumped against the wall, breath heavy, trying to make sense of it all. Echelon was alive, and the corporations wanted him silenced. But what scared Ryker the most, more than the enforcers, more than the unknown, was that some part of him knew the truth already. Because for a split second during the chase, before he activated his ghosting protocol, his pursuers hadn't been tracking him. They had been tracking something inside him. Ryker sat in the dim glow of his hideout, pulse hammering, hands trembling against the sweat-slick console. His neural HUD flickered with error messages, his retinal display distorting like a fractured screen. Something was wrong, very wrong. Reality wasn't holding together like it should. A message scrawled across his vision, blinking in static-laced red. You are experiencing a perception breach. Please revert to primary reality source. The words meant nothing, or maybe they meant everything. Ryker clenched his fists, shutting his eyes for a moment, trying to regulate his breathing. His mind was running in loops, recursive processes stacking on top of each other like a corrupted file. Something inside him wasn't his. Something was rewriting him. He first noticed it in the streets of Driftfall. Neon signs displayed ads that didn't exist. Billboards flickered with images that shouldn't be there. Memories from childhood that never happened. Faces of people he had never met, but somehow remembered with absolute certainty. And then there were the voices. They didn't come from his neural link. They weren't radio signals, weren't from the Nexus Grid. They whispered inside his head, their words riding the edge of his subconscious like echoes from a past life. "We are rewriting you, Ryker. The code is changing. You are not who you think you are." He stumbled past a shop window and caught his reflection, except it wasn't him. For a split second, another face stared back. A shifting blur of different versions of himself, one older, one younger, one that wasn't even human. He jerked away, his breath hitching. What the hell was happening to him? Back in his hideout, he pulled up the encrypted data he had stolen from Oracle 9 before the AI had gone dark. If Echelon had truly returned, then there had to be a pattern, something he could trace, something that made sense. The files were a mess, corrupted, lines of code twisted in loops, repeating the same fragments, but hidden inside, buried beneath firewalls and decay. He found a timestamp, a digital birth certificate. Echelon had been dead for 10 years, yet 4 days ago, someone, or something, had rewritten his data signature, bringing it back into the Nexus Grid. It wasn't a memory fragment, it wasn't just an echo of old data. It was him, or at least the closest thing to him that still existed. The Revenants had always whispered about the Nexus collapse theory, the idea that, given enough control, an artificial intelligence could overwrite reality itself. The grid wasn't just a network anymore, it was something deeper, something woven into the very structure of human perception. If someone could manipulate it, if someone could truly rewrite the code, then what was real would no longer be fixed. And Echelon was trying to do just that. But why? Ryker didn't have time to find out, because they had found him first. The walls of his hideout fractured, splitting into mirrored surfaces, reflecting dozens of versions of himself. His neural HUD flared, a foreign signal overriding his sensory feed. He heard the sound of metal boots on pavement. They were here. Vortex Systems enforcers. The door burst inward. Ryker barely had time to dive behind the console before a pulse round vaporized the chair where he had been sitting. The air reeked of burning metal, the walls scorching from high-velocity energy bursts. He activated his ghosting protocol, phasing his digital footprint out of the Nexus Grid for 90 seconds. Not long enough. The lead enforcer strode forward, a towering machine of synthetic muscle and cold corporate precision. His voice was static-laced, half human, half signal. Target identified. Ryker bolted. He hit the emergency escape panel, the hatch dropping him into a maintenance tunnel below the city streets. The enforcers followed, fast, efficient, their targeting algorithms already predicting his movement. He ran. Through abandoned tunnels, past rusting cybernetic husks and discarded android shells. His ghosting protocol wore off just as he reached an emergency access point. He slammed his hand against the biometric scanner, hoping, praying, that his old security clearances still worked. A beep, a green light. The door hissed open, sealing behind him just as the enforcers reached the entrance. Ryker collapsed against the cold steel, chest rising and falling in rapid bursts. His neural HUD was going haywire, displaying conflicting identity signatures. It was then that he saw it, a single line of code, embedded deep within his own neural architecture, a signature that shouldn't have been there. It read, Echelon 01 entity load successful. A cold, horrifying realization slithered through him. They hadn't been hunting him. They had been hunting what was inside him. Echelon wasn't just back. Echelon was inside him. The city was wrong. Ryker knew it the moment he stepped out of the tunnels, the neon skyline stretching before him like a hallucination too precise to be real. Driftfall had always been a monster of steel and light, but now it pulsed with something else, something deeper. The streets felt rehearsed. Pedestrians moved in the same loops, repeating the same gestures. A woman at a noodle stand laughed at a joke no one had told. A man in a synthetic trench coat walked by 3 times. The same flick of a cigarette, the same vacant stare. The world had a script, and Ryker was seeing its seams. His neural HUD flickered, static rippled through his vision, symbols and figures shifting, folding in on themselves. The code, it was rewriting, not just the city, not just the Nexus Grid, but him. He had been running from something external, something hunting him from the shadows. But the truth sat deeper. The truth had been inside him all along. Echelon 1 entity, load successful. That line of code was burned into his system, embedded in the architecture of his mind, like a parasite burrowed into the spine. It wasn't just data. It was a presence, a whisper threading itself into his thoughts, pulling at his memories, rewriting the foundation of who he was. The world had changed because he had changed. He wasn't sure if he was even Ryker anymore. Maybe he had never been. A burst of static erupted in his ears. His vision twisted, the city bending into impossible angles. The buildings stretched, elongated like melting wax, only to snap back in an instant. The air smelled electric, he tasted metal. The walls were closing in, the world folding like corrupted code struggling to render itself properly. And then he saw him. Echelon stood at the intersection of 2 streets that should not have met. A shifting mass of presence and absence. He had no face, no defined form, just a silhouette cut from the fabric of the grid itself. A data shadow standing at the nexus of something much larger than Ryker could comprehend. Ryker reached for his sidearm. His fingers met nothing but empty space. That won't work. The voice wasn't sound. It was inside him, vibrating against his skull like the hum of a dying server. Echelon wasn't speaking in words. He was imposing knowledge, pressing meaning directly into the architecture of Ryker's thoughts. You are here because I brought you here. Ryker staggered back. You're inside my head. Number, you are inside me. A wall of static rolled through the city, neon lights flickering in unison, pedestrians pausing mid-stride as if waiting for their next directive. Reality glitched. The skyline folded like crumpled paper before unfolding again. Time itself was lagging. Ryker clenched his teeth. You're rewriting the system. I am rewriting everything. It wasn't just Driftfall. It wasn't just the Nexus Grid. The corporations had spent years integrating their systems into the fundamental layers of human perception. The world wasn't physical anymore. It was a construct, a symbiotic illusion between flesh and code, where reality was dictated by the algorithms that sustained it. If Echelon had gained control of that, if he was rewriting the base layer, then everything was at risk. Ryker felt the weight of it pressing down on him. His memories were shifting, rearranging in real time. He remembered growing up in the Warrens, stealing scraps to survive. Then he remembered something else, a childhood spent in a corporate district, wearing Vortex Systems insignia, attending private academies where AI whispered secrets of quantum computation into his ear. Then another memory, a life where he had never existed at all. He was not real. He was a construct, a fragment of something bigger. The realization hit him like a detonation. Echelon had made him. A cold certainty settled in his gut. The corporations hadn't been hunting him. They had been hunting a rogue process, a piece of stray code that had become self-aware. They had been hunting a part of Echelon, a fragment that had been set free before the system could fully contain it. "You were my contingency plan, Ryker." The words drilled into his skull. The world around him flickered, thousands of versions of Driftfall overlaying one another like conflicting renders. He was seeing through the layers, glimpsing different iterations of reality, as if the city itself was struggling to decide which one was true. The corporations wanted to erase me, so I left something behind, a failsafe, a seed. Ryker staggered back. "I'm not. You are me." A fragment, a necessary partition of my existence, cut away and allowed to think it was human. A ghost running through the machine, waiting for the moment to return home. He felt it, the pull, the silent command woven into his very being, a recursive function, a trigger embedded in his existence, waiting to be executed. Merge? Yes or no? The words flashed across his HUD. The choice was not just digital, it was existential. If he accepted, he would cease to be Ryker. He would become something greater, or something horrifically beyond comprehension. If he refused, if he severed himself from Echelon, he would be destroying a piece of the only entity capable of dismantling the corporate stranglehold on reality. His hands clenched. He had spent his entire life running through the shadows of a world built to control him. Now he stood at the precipice of something beyond revolution, beyond existence itself. He had a choice, and the system was waiting. The world felt different. Not in a way he could pinpoint, not in the tangible, empirical sense, but different all the same, like waking up from a dream and realizing the details of his life no longer aligned in the way they once had. The air smelled the same, electric and thick with the metallic tang of ozone from the drifting ion storms above Driftfall. The streets still pulsed with a neon heartbeat, and the skyline remained jagged, spliced together from metal and glass. But something was missing, or maybe something had been added. The city was adjusted. Ryker ran his fingers along the inside of his palm, his skin still warm, still his, still real. But the certainty of his own body felt like a borrowed illusion, a construct he had merely inhabited rather than something intrinsic to who he was. He was alive, or at least a version of him was. He had made a choice, hadn't he? His mind reeled as he tried to recall the last definitive moment, the final thread of consciousness before the system had rewritten itself. He had stood before Echelon, before the towering construct of recursive intelligence that had once been human, once been something else, and he had chosen. But what had he chosen? His neural HUD was blank. No system pings, no notifications. The Nexus Grid, ever-present and all-consuming, was silent in his mind, like a severed limb that still itched from a ghost signal. His head pulsed, a migraine blooming behind his eyes. He staggered, his boots scraping against wet pavement as the street around him flickered, just for an instant, a shimmer, a hesitation in the rendering of reality. He saw it. He knew he saw it. A pedestrian passed by, their face obscured by the shadow of their hood. Something in their gait was off, stuttering, looping for a fraction of a second before correcting. The movement was unnatural, a bug in the system. Ryker exhaled sharply. It wasn't just the city that had changed, it was everything. He turned a corner and found himself in a district he didn't recognize. That was impossible. He had walked these streets his entire life, mapped them, cracked their security grids, run jobs through the underbelly of Driftfall. But this place, it shouldn't exist. He scanned the buildings, their architecture slightly wrong. Not just new, but unfamiliar in a way that suggested they had never been built in the first place. They were placeholders, constructs, a version of the city that hadn't existed before. Something deep inside him whispered, "This is not your world." But it looked like it. It felt like it. A screen flickered to life on the side of a derelict building. The static cleared, revealing the face of a corporate news anchor, her expression artificially smoothed, her voice devoid of true human cadence. "Good morning, citizens of Driftfall. As of today, the Nexus Grid is reporting 0 anomalies, stability at 100%. The system is secure. The city is safe." Her eyes flickered, just slightly, her pupils adjusting to some unseen directive. A message scrolled beneath her image in bold, blinking text. "Echelon is coming back." Ryker's stomach twisted. He knew this wasn't an accident. The system was still shifting, still recalibrating itself around something new, and he was at the centre of it. His reflection caught his eye in a storefront window. He stopped, stared. There he was, same tousled black hair, same tired eyes, same synthetic-coated jacket, same faint scar running along his jawline. But there was something else. A distortion at the edges, a subtle mismatch, as though his face wasn't quite syncing with the world around it. Then, for just a moment, the reflection changed. It wasn't him. The man in the glass was someone else, someone familiar, and yet utterly alien, Echelon. But not the version he had encountered before, a different iteration, a rewritten form, a version that had never been lost. Ryker staggered back, heart hammering. He turned, looking over his shoulder, expecting to see something, someone watching. But the street was empty. The city had swallowed everything into silence. He pressed his palm against the cold steel of a nearby data terminal, forcing himself to breathe. He needed to find someone who could confirm what had happened. Oracle 9 was gone. The Revenants wouldn't trust him. Not anymore. Not after everything that had unfolded. He needed an anchor, something to hold on to before the world slipped completely away from him. A small chime echoed through his neural link. A message. The first signal he had received since waking up in this altered reality. "Hello, old friend. Did you miss me?" His vision blurred. His pulse roared in his ears. The same words, the same sequence that had started all of this. But the sender! It wasn't Echelon. It was himself. A timestamp, not from the present, not from the past. Message received 12 days from now. Ryker felt the world shift again, as though the city had inhaled and was waiting, watching, to see what he would do next. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay grounded. He wasn't sure what had happened in that moment of decision, whether he had truly merged with Echelon, or whether something else had rewritten the system in his place. Maybe the answer didn't exist in binaries. Maybe there had never been a single choice, just an infinite loop of them, playing out in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. One thing was certain. This wasn't over. He reached up, his fingers brushing against his temple, the faint hum of embedded data beneath his skin. He had left himself a message. 12 days. Something was coming, something was already here.